The morning mist clung to the magnolia trees like a shroud when Detective Sarah Martinez pulled into the parking lot of the Millbrook Police Department, her hands trembling against the steering wheel. In her passenger seat lay a manila folder that had kept her awake for 3 consecutive nights, a folder containing DNA results that would shatter a community's 13-year-old assumptions about justice, truth, and the woman they thought they knew. Inside that folder was the name Evelyn Thomas. The name belonged to a 67-year-old retired school librarian who had spent the better part of 2 decades organizing charity drives, reading to children at the public library every Saturday morning, and tending to her late husband's rose garden with the devotion of a monk. The same woman who had brought casseroles to every funeral, baby shower gift to every birth announcement, and who still hand-wrote thank you notes on cream-colored stationery that smelled faintly of lavender. The same woman whose DNA matched evidence from the 2010 murder of Rebecca Walsh. Sarah's breath fogged the windshield as she stared at the brick building before her, its American flag hanging limp in the Alabama humidity. She had been a rookie officer when Rebecca's body was found in Willow Creek Park, beaten and strangled, her 24-year-old life cut short on a Tuesday evening in October. The case had consumed the department for months, then years, before finally settling into the cold case files like sediment at the bottom of a lake. Rebecca had been a substitute teacher, new to Millbrook, with curly auburn hair and a laugh that could be heard 3 classrooms away. She coached a middle school debate team and volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. Her parents had moved from Ohio after her death, unable to bear the weight of unanswered questions and the ghost of their daughter around every corner. The evidence had been sparse: no witnesses, no clear motive, no suspects with solid connections to Rebecca. The investigation had focused on transients, on Rebecca's few casual relationships, on random acts of violence by strangers passing through town. Never on Evelyn Thomas, who had attended Rebecca's funeral and wept genuine tears, who had donated money to the scholarship fund established in Rebecca's name. Sarah's phone buzzed against the dashboard. A text from her partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez. Lab confirmed it twice. No contamination. It's her. The certainty felt like swallowing glass. Sarah had grown up in Millbrook, had checked out countless books from Evelyn's library, and had received one of those lavender-scented thank you notes when she'd helped Evelyn's husband Harold after his heart attack in 2018. She remembered Evelyn's gentle hands and her way of listening, really listening, when people spoke, as if their words were precious things to be carefully collected and preserved. But DNA didn't lie, and the evidence was overwhelming. Skin cells under Rebecca's fingernails, hair fibers on her jacket, blood on a rock near where the body was found, blood that belonged to Evelyn Thomas. The parking lot gravel crunched under Sarah's boots as she finally emerged from her car, the October morning air carrying the same crisp promise it had 13 years ago when Rebecca Walsh's life had ended in violence. Sarah's hand found the gold cross at her throat, a nervous habit that had intensified over her 15-year career in law enforcement, but had never felt more necessary than it did walking toward a building where she would have to convince her colleagues, her friends, that the woman who had baked cookies for their children's school fundraisers was a killer. Inside, the station hummed as its usual rhythm. Officer Janet Pike was processing a drunken disorderly from the night before. Sergeant Tom Williams was filling out paperwork for a minor fender bender. The coffee maker gurgled in the break room, and someone had brought in donuts from Mel's Bakery downtown. Normal, peaceful, about to be shattered. Mike Rodriguez looked up from his desk as Sarah approached, his dark eyes heavy with the same burden she carried. At 45, he had seen enough to develop the kind of philosophical resignation that kept good cops sane, but this case had stripped away that protective cynicism. He had daughters Rebecca's age. "Chief wants to see us in his office," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's been pacing for an hour."
Chief Robert Henderson was a 30-year veteran of the force, a man who had guided Millbrook through integration, through economic downturns, through the kind of social changes that could tear small southern towns apart. He was 62 years old, planning to retire in 3 years, and had never arrested someone he'd known personally for murder. "Close the door," Henderson said as they entered his office. The walls were lined with commendations, photographs with politicians, and a framed picture of his grandson's Little League team, a team that Evelyn Thomas had sponsored last season. Sarah placed the folder on Henderson's desk like an offering to an angry god. "Tell me again," Henderson said, though they had been over this twice already. "Tell me how we're certain." Mike opened the folder, revealing photographs, lab reports, and a timeline that had taken weeks to construct. The 2010 evidence was well preserved. When the state lab got their new DNA analysis equipment last year, they started running old samples through the system. Rebecca's case was in the batch. And the match? 99.7% certainty, Sarah said. "We ran it twice. Different samples, different technicians. Same result." Henderson studied a photograph of Evelyn Thomas from the previous year's Millbrook Gazette Christmas feature, where she was pictured with an armload of wrapped presents for the children's home. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her cardigan buttoned to the collar, her smile warm and genuine. "Motive?" Henderson asked. "Still working on that," Mike admitted. On the surface, they had no connection. Rebecca had been in town for only 6 months. She wasn't dating anyone seriously, didn't have any known conflicts. But Henderson's police instincts detected the hesitation in Mike's voice. Sarah pulled out a photocopy of a newspaper article from October 2010. Rebecca was substitute teaching at Millbrook Elementary during the weeks before her death. Evelyn volunteered there twice a week reading to the first-grade classes. So they knew each other. More than that, Mike said, producing another document. Rebecca had applied for a full-time teaching position that opened up in September 2010. 4th grade. She was one of 3 finalists. Henderson leaned back in his chair, processing. And Evelyn Thomas was on the hiring committee. The silence in the office stretched like a held breath. Outside, a mockingbird was cycling through its repertoire of stolen songs, and someone was mowing grass despite the early hour. "That's not much of a motive for murder," Henderson said finally. "No," Sarah agreed, "but it's a connection, and we're just starting to dig." Henderson stood and walked to his window, which looked out over Main Street. He could see the public library from here, its red brick facade and white columns a monument to learning and community service. Evelyn Thomas would be there in 2 hours, settling in behind the reference desk, helping high school students with research projects and recommending romance novels to the book club ladies. "What's our next step?" he asked. "We need to bring her in, carefully, quietly. We need to talk to people who knew both women, find out what happened between them." Henderson nodded slowly. "I want this done right, by the book, no leaks, no speculation. We owe it to Rebecca Walsh to get justice, and we owe it to this community to handle this with dignity." He turned back to face his detectives, his expression grave. "Because I'll tell you right now, when word gets out, this town is going to come apart at the seams." Evelyn Thomas had always believed that a person's character was revealed not in grand gestures, but in the 1,000 small acts that comprised a life lived with intention. She arrived at the Millbrook Library every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 8:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her volunteer shift began, carrying her mother's worn leather satchel and a thermos of coffee that she would nurse throughout the morning. The routine had sustained her through Harold's illness, through the hollow months after his death, through the peculiar loneliness that came with being 70 years old in a town where most of her contemporaries had moved to Florida or passed away entirely. The library was her anchor, the children her purpose, the books her solace. This particular Tuesday morning carried the crisp promise of autumn, and Evelyn paused on the library steps to breathe in the scent of burning leaves and dying flowers. Her hands, spotted with age, but still steady, adjusted the burgundy scarf Harold had given her for their 40th anniversary. She had worn it every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 3 years, a small act of remembrance that felt more like prayer than mourning. "Good morning, Mrs. Thomas," called Janet Russell, the head librarian, as Evelyn entered the building. The familiar smell of old books and floor polish welcomed her like an embrace. "Good morning, dear. I see we have quite a crowd for storytime preparation." Indeed, the children's section bustled with activity as volunteers arranged chairs in concentric circles and tested the microphone system. Evelyn's Tuesday reading group had grown from 7 children to nearly 30 over the past 2 years, and the library had struggled to accommodate the expansion while maintaining the intimate atmosphere that made the session special. Evelyn settled at the small desk in the children's corner, unpacking her supplies with methodical precision of a surgeon. Hand sanitizer, reading glasses in their embroidered case, a package of stickers featuring various farm animals, the copy of Charlotte's Web that she had been reading to the second-grade group, its pages worn soft from handling. At exactly 9 a.m., the first children began arriving with their parents or caregivers. Evelyn knew each child by name, knew their favorite books, their fears about thunderstorms or the dark, their excitement about lost teeth and upcoming birthdays. She had a gift for seeing past the surface. The shy child who needed extra encouragement, the boisterous one who craved attention, the careful observer who absorbed everything, but spoke little. "Mrs. Thomas, Mrs. Thomas." 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez bounded toward her, dark curls bouncing with each step. "I lost another tooth. Look!"
Emma opened her mouth to display the gap where an incisor had been, and Evelyn clapped her hands together with genuine delight. "My goodness, that's wonderful news! Did the tooth fairy visit?" "She gave me $2 because it was a front tooth," Emma whispered conspiratorially. "Front teeth are definitely worth extra," Evelyn agreed solemnly. As more children gathered, Evelyn began the ritual that had evolved over months of reading together. First, the welcome song, a simple melody that even the youngest could follow. Then, a moment for sharing news. Finally, the story itself, with Evelyn's voice rising and falling with the emotional peaks and valleys of the narrative. Today's chapter found Charlotte the spider explaining to Wilbur the pig the harsh realities of life and death, the inevitable passage of seasons, the way all creatures must eventually say goodbye. Evelyn's voice never faltered as she read these passages, though her throat tightened slightly at Charlotte's matter-of-fact acceptance of mortality. "Some pig," she read, describing the words Charlotte had woven into her web to save Wilbur's life. "Terrific, radiant, humble." 8-year-old Marcus Washington raised his hand. "Mrs. Thomas, why does Charlotte have to die? Can't she just live forever like in the fairy tales?" Evelyn set the book in her lap and considered her response carefully. She had learned over the years that children could handle far more truth than adults typically gave them credit for. But that truth needed to be offered with tenderness, like medicine sweetened with honey. "Well, Marcus, I think Charlotte knew something very important about life. She understood that the love we give and the good we do while we're here, that's what lasts forever. Even after our bodies can't continue, the love remains." "Like how we still remember my grandpa even though he died last year?" asked Sophia Chen, her voice small but curious. "Exactly like that, sweetheart. Your grandfather's love for you didn't die with him. It lives on in your heart, in the lessons he taught you, in the way you care for others because he showed you how to be caring." The children absorbed this with the serious consideration they reserved for truly important matters. Evelyn glanced at the clock and realized that the hour had passed more quickly than usual, a phenomenon she attributed to the particular magic that occurred when stories and listeners found their perfect rhythm together. After the children left with their parents, chattering about spiders and pigs and the mysteries of friendship, Evelyn remained at her desk to update her notes.
She kept detailed records of each child's progress, their favorite genres, their reading level improvements. It was meticulous work that no one required of her, but she felt a deep responsibility to nurture each young mind as carefully as Harold had tended his roses. "Evelyn, you work harder than I do, and I'm getting paid," Janet Russell said, approaching with 2 cups of tea. "Oh, this isn't work. This is joy. These children remind me why stories matter." Janet settled into the chair beside Evelyn's desk, a luxury she rarely allowed herself during the busy weekday hours. At 42, she had been the head librarian for 8 years, and she often said that hiring Evelyn as a volunteer had been the best decision of her professional career. "I have to ask you something," Janet said, her tone shifting to something more serious. "The school board called yesterday. They're looking for volunteers to help with literacy assessment testing for the elementary schools." Evelyn's hands stilled on her teacup. "Assessment testing? Nothing dramatic, just one-on-one reading evaluations to help identify children who might need extra support. They specifically requested you." The request should have felt like an honor, recognition of Evelyn's skill and dedication. Instead, it settled in her stomach like a cold stone. She thought of Rebecca Walsh, the young substitute teacher who had been so eager to help, so determined to make a difference. Rebecca had volunteered for every extra assignment, every after-school program, every opportunity to prove her worth to a school system that had ultimately chosen someone else for the permanent position she had desperately wanted. "I'm not sure I'm qualified for something so official," Evelyn said carefully. "Are you kidding? You've been working with these children for 2 years. You know their strengths and challenges better than anyone. Plus, you have your teaching background from before you became a librarian." That was true, though Evelyn rarely spoke of her early career. She had taught 4th grade for 7 years in the 1970s, before budget cuts had eliminated her position and she had transitioned to library science. Those had been different times, when teachers wielded more authority and commanded greater respect, when a firm word could redirect a misbehaving child and parents supported educational discipline rather than question it. "Could I think about it?" Evelyn asked. "Of course, they don't need an answer until next week." After Janet returned to her duties, Evelyn sat alone with her thoughts and her cooling tea. The library hummed quietly around her, the whisper of turning pages, the soft conversation at the reference desk, the gentle hum of the heating system as it fought against the October chill. These sounds had become the soundtrack of her later years, as familiar and comforting as Harold's breathing had once been beside her in bed. But today, the peace felt fragile, as if something was shifting beneath the surface of her carefully constructed routine. She thought of the police car she had noticed parked across from the library that morning, its occupant hidden behind tinted windows, but the vehicle's presence somehow ominous in its stillness. Evelyn pulled her cardigan closer around her shoulders and returned to her notes, writing in the precise Palmer script she had learned 70 years earlier. Emma R. Excellent comprehension, beginning to read independently. Marcus W. Struggles with longer words but shows enthusiasm. Sophia C. Advanced reader, may benefit from more challenging material. The familiar ritual of documentation soothed her nerves, each careful notation an act of faith in the future, in the belief that these children would continue growing and learning long after her involvement in their lives had ended. She had always found comfort in the permanence of the written word, in the way thoughts and observations could be preserved between covers or in filing systems, safe from the unreliability of memory. At noon, Evelyn packed her supplies with the same methodical care with which she had unpacked them. The children's laughter echoed from the playground across the street, and she paused to watch them through the tall windows, their bright jackets and backpacks creating a kaleidoscope of movement against the autumn landscape. Tomorrow, she would return for her Thursday session. Next week, she would likely accept the school board's request because service to children had always been her calling, her way of contributing something meaningful to a world that often felt chaotic and uncertain. She would continue the small rituals that gave her life structure and purpose, continue the careful tending of young minds that felt like the most important work she had ever done. But as she walked to her car, Evelyn could not shake the feeling that something was ending, that the routine that had sustained her was about to be interrupted by forces beyond her control. The police car was gone from its morning position, but she noticed another one parked near the post office and a third outside Murphy's Diner. It was probably nothing. Small towns thrived on minor mysteries and the kind of speculation that transformed ordinary events into neighborhood drama. Still, Evelyn drove home more slowly than usual, taking the long route past the cemetery where Harold rested beneath a modest granite stone, past the elementary school where she might soon be evaluating children's reading skills, past Willow Creek Park, where she sometimes walked in the evenings when solitude became too heavy to bear alone. Her small house on Maple Street welcomed her with its familiar scents of lemon oil and the jasmine tea she brewed each afternoon. The roses Harold had planted still bloomed along the front walk, though Evelyn lacked his intuitive understanding of their needs and sometimes felt like an inadequate caretaker of his horticultural legacy. She hung her burgundy scarf in the front closet and put the kettle on for tea, maintaining the rhythms that had carried her through 3 years of widowhood. But as she settled into Harold's recliner with her cup and the afternoon paper, Evelyn found herself staring out the front window at the quiet street, watching for movement, listening for sounds that might signal change approaching like storm clouds on a clear horizon. The newspaper's headlines spoke of distant troubles, political conflicts, economic uncertainties, natural disasters in places she would never visit. But buried on page 3 was a small item about the police department receiving state funding for new forensic equipment, technology that would help solve old cases that had grown cold with time. Evelyn folded the paper carefully and set it aside, her tea growing cold as she sat in the gathering shadows of late afternoon, surrounded by the accumulated memories of a life lived quietly but not without purpose, wondering if the peace she had constructed would prove strong enough to weather whatever was coming. The arrest warrant was signed at 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, the ink barely dry when Detective Sarah Martinez felt her hands begin to shake. She had requested the warrant be dated for the following Monday, hoping for time to prepare the community, to coordinate with social services for the children who would be traumatized by Evelyn Thomas's removal from their lives. But District Attorney Catherine Mills had been firm. Evidence this compelling could not wait for convenience or comfort. "We do this clean and professional," Chief Henderson reminded his team as they gathered in the conference room that had become their war room over the past 2 weeks. The walls were covered with timelines, photographs, and evidence logs, a murder board that told the story of Rebecca Walsh's final days and the 13-year path to justice that had led them to Evelyn Thomas. The investigation had revealed more than anyone had anticipated. Financial records showed that Evelyn had borrowed $5,000 against her late husband's life insurance policy in September 2010, money that had been repaid in full just 3 weeks after Rebecca's death. Phone records indicated that Evelyn had made 17 calls to the school district office in the 2 weeks following the hiring committee's decision to offer the 4th-grade teaching position to Rebecca, rather than the internal candidate Evelyn had championed. Most damning of all was the discovery of a composition notebook in Evelyn's home, found during the execution of a search warrant while she attended her Thursday morning reading session at the library. The notebook contained detailed observations about Rebecca Walsh's daily routines, her apartment complex, her walking routes, her Friday evening volunteer shifts at the animal shelter. page after page of careful notation written in Evelyn's distinctive Palmer script, documenting the movements of a young woman who had trusted her community to keep her safe. Detective Mike Rodriguez had been the one to find the notebook, tucked between recipe collections and gardening journals on a shelf in Evelyn's kitchen. He had called Sarah immediately, his voice tight with the kind of professional control that masked deeper emotions. She was stalking her, he had said simply, for weeks. Now, as the arrest team prepared to drive to the library where Evelyn was undoubtedly reading Charlotte's Web to the group of 8-year-olds, Sarah found herself struggling with the cognitive dissonance of it all. She had reviewed the evidence countless times, had verified and re-verified every connection, every timeline, every piece of forensic proof. The case was solid. Evelyn Thomas had murdered Rebecca Walsh in a fit of rage over a teaching job, and then had spent 13 years hiding behind a facade of community service and gentle grandmotherly kindness. But knowing it intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two entirely different challenges. "Martinez, you okay?" Chief Henderson's voice cut through her internal struggle. "Yes, sir. Just processing. I get it. This one's gonna stay with all of us. But we owe Rebecca Walsh justice, and we owe this community the truth, no matter how much it hurts." The arrest was planned for 4:15 p.m., after the children's story time had ended, but before Evelyn would leave the library. They would approach quietly, respectfully, with minimal drama to protect the children and library staff who would witness the beginning of Millbrook's most shocking criminal case in decades. Officer Janet Pike would secure the building's exits. Detective Rodriguez would handle crowd control and witness interviews. Detective Martinez would make the arrest, reading the charges in the same calm, professional tone she had used hundreds of times before, never imagining she would use it while placing handcuffs on the woman who had helped her daughter with a science fair project just 6 months earlier. As the team left the station, Sarah caught sight of the afternoon newspaper's headline, "Local Police Receive Grant for Cold Case Initiative." The story, published just that morning, would seem prophetic by evening when news of Evelyn's arrest spread through the community like wildfire through dry grass. At the Millbrook Public Library, Evelyn was just concluding her reading of Chapter 14, in which Charlotte's children prepare to leave the barn, scattering to start new lives while carrying forward the lessons their mother had taught them. The irony was not lost on Sarah as she watched through the library's front windows, seeing Evelyn's animated gestures as she brought the story to life for her young audience. "Some pig," 8-year-old Marcus was reading along, his finger following the words Charlotte had woven into her web. "That's right," Evelyn encouraged him. Charlotte used her gift, her ability to spin beautiful webs, to save her friend. We all have gifts we can use to help others. "What's your gift, Mrs. Thomas?" asked Sophia Chen. Evelyn considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all the children's inquiries. "I think my gift is listening, sweetheart, really listening to people and helping them find the stories they need to hear." Through the window, Sarah watched this exchange and felt her chest tighten. Even now, even knowing what she knew, there was something genuinely caring in Evelyn's interaction with the children. The contradiction threatened to undermine Sarah's professional resolve. At 4:10 p.m., the last child left with their parent, and library staff began their closing routine. Sarah entered first, her badge visible but her weapon holstered, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that the next few minutes would change everything for everyone involved. "Mrs. Thomas." Sarah's voice carried across the children's section, causing Evelyn to look up from her careful packing of storytime supplies. "Detective Martinez, how nice to see you. Is everything all right?" Evelyn's voice carried genuine warmth, the same tone she had used when offering to help with Sarah's daughter's school project. "Mrs. Thomas, I need you to come with me. There are some questions we need to ask you about Rebecca Walsh." The name fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that seemed to emanate outward through the library's quiet space. Sarah watched as something shifted in Evelyn's expression, not surprise exactly, but rather the subtle tightening of someone who had been expecting this moment for 13 years. Rebecca Walsh, Evelyn repeated, her voice steady but somehow smaller than it had been moments before. The substitute teacher who was killed. Yes, ma'am. We have some new information, and we need to discuss it with you downtown. Head librarian Janet Russell had approached from the reference desk, her face creased with concern. Is there some kind of problem, detective? Sarah kept her eyes on Evelyn, watching for any sign of flight response or panic. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like relief, as if a burden Evelyn had been carrying had finally become too heavy to bear alone. Am I under arrest? Evelyn asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke, acrid and impossible to ignore. Sarah felt the weight of her badge, her oath, her duty to the community and to Rebecca Walsh's memory. Yes, ma'am. You are.
Janet Russell gasped audibly, and Sarah could hear the whispered conversations of library patrons who had stopped their activities to watch the scene unfolding in the children's section. Sarah began reciting the Miranda warning, her voice professional and clear, while Detective Rodriguez quietly positioned himself near the library's main entrance. The words that every police officer knew by heart took on surreal quality when directed at a woman who had spent the afternoon reading about friendship and sacrifice to a group of elementary school children. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Evelyn set down her book bag with careful precision, as if she were completing one final library task before transitioning to whatever would come next. She did not ask what charges were being brought against her. She did not protest her innocence or demand to know what evidence the police believed they possessed. Instead, she stood quietly, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting for the handcuffs with the same patient dignity she brought to all of life's challenges. "Mrs. Thomas, I don't understand," Janet Russell said, her voice cracking with emotion. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," Sarah replied, though saying the words aloud felt like swallowing glass. "Mrs. Thomas is being charged with the murder of Rebecca Walsh." The library erupted in hushed gasps and whispered conversations. Mrs. Hendricks from the book club dropped her romance novel. Teenage volunteers sorting returned books stood frozen, staring at the scene unfolding before them. The quiet sanctuary that Evelyn had helped nurture for years was transforming into a crime scene, another location that would forever be associated with Millbrook's most shocking revelation. As Sarah placed the handcuffs on Evelyn's wrists, gently, more gently than procedure typically required, she noticed that the older woman was trembling slightly, though whether from fear, relief, or simple physical response to stress was impossible to determine. "Will someone call my nephew?" Evelyn asked quietly. "David Thomas, in Montgomery. His number is in my book bag." "Yes, ma'am. We'll make sure he's contacted." The walk from the library to the police car felt like a funeral procession, with curious onlookers gathering on the sidewalk despite the late afternoon chill. Sarah could see cell phones emerging from pockets and purses, documenting the moment when Millbrook's most trusted volunteer became its most notorious criminal defendant. Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store stood with her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. Bill Murphy from the diner kept shaking his head as if he could physically reject what he was witnessing. Children who had been playing in the small park across the street were being quickly gathered by their parents, who spoke in urgent whispers while stealing glances at the police activity. "I can't believe it," someone said. "She taught my grandson to read. There has to be an explanation. This isn't possible." But as Sarah helped Evelyn into the back seat of the police cruiser, she caught the older woman's eyes in the rearview mirror and saw something that looked remarkably like acceptance. Not the wild-eyed panic of someone falsely accused, but the weary resignation of someone whose long-held secret had finally been exposed to daylight.
The drive to the police station took only 7 minutes, but news of the arrest traveled faster than the police car. By the time they pulled into the police station parking lot, reporters from 3 local news stations were already setting up equipment, and the police department's phone was ringing continuously with calls from shocked community members demanding information, explanation, or simple confirmation that the rumors spreading through social media were true. Inside the station, Evelyn was processed with the same methodical efficiency used for all arrestees: fingerprints, photographs, and personal property inventory. She complied with each requirement without protest, answering basic questions in a soft but clear voice. When asked if she wanted to call a lawyer, she nodded affirmatively. When offered the opportunity to make a statement, she declined politely but firmly. "I'd like to speak with my nephew first, and then perhaps we can discuss everything properly." The booking process revealed few surprises. Evelyn carried no weapons, no drugs, no contraband of any kind. Her purse contained the usual items of an elderly woman: reading glasses, tissues, breath mints, a small devotional book, $17 in cash, and a laminated photograph of her late husband Harold in his army uniform. But tucked into her wallet, behind her driver's license and Medicare card, investigators found a small newspaper clipping from October 2010. Rebecca Walsh's obituary, carefully cut from the Millbrook Gazette and preserved for 13 years, like a pressed flower or a love letter. The discovery sent a chill through the booking room. Sarah stared at the fragile piece of paper, yellowed with age but still clearly readable, and understood that they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple crime of passion or momentary rage. Why would she keep this? Officer Pike wondered aloud. Guilt, Detective Rodriguez suggested. Or maybe some kind of trophy. But Sarah studied Evelyn's face as they showed her the clipping, watching for reactions that might provide insight into 13 years of carefully constructed normalcy built on top of buried violence. What she saw was neither guilt nor pride, but something that looked strangely like grief, as if Evelyn mourned not only the young woman she had killed, but also the version of herself that had been lost in that moment of irreversible action. As evening settled over Millbrook, bringing with it the kind of crisp October air that usually signaled cozy dinners and high school football games, the police station buzzed with unprecedented activity. Phone calls from reporters, visits from concerned citizens, meetings with the district attorney's office, and the complex logistics of preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most high-profile criminal case in the town's history. Evelyn Thomas sat in the holding cell, her burgundy scarf folded neatly beside her, reading her small devotional book by the harsh fluorescent light. To anyone observing her, she might have appeared to be simply waiting for a bus or sitting in a doctor's office, calm, patient, dignified despite the circumstances that had brought her to this place. But 13 years after Rebecca Walsh's murder, as news trucks gathered outside the Millbrook Police Department and social media exploded with shocked reactions from a community struggling to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the crimes she was accused of committing, the truth was finally beginning to emerge from its long burial in carefully maintained silence. And for the first time since October 2010, Rebecca Walsh's parents in Ohio received a phone call from Alabama, informing them that their daughter's killer had been found, and that justice, delayed but not abandoned, was finally within reach. The confession came 3 days after the arrest, on a Sunday morning when most of Millbrook was in church, praying for guidance in a situation that had shattered their fundamental beliefs about good and evil, about the people they chose to trust, about the very nature of the community they had built together. David Thomas arrived from Montgomery within hours of his uncle's arrest, a soft-spoken insurance adjuster in his 40s who had maintained a close relationship with Evelyn since his Uncle Harold's death. He brought with him Margaret Caldwell, one of Alabama's most respected criminal defense attorneys, a woman whose silver hair and gentle manner masked a brilliant legal mind and a fierce commitment to ensuring that even the most controversial defendants received competent representation. The confession began not as a formal statement to police, but as a conversation between aunt and nephew in the attorney consultation room at the Millbrook Police Department. A conversation that Margaret Caldwell ultimately convinced Evelyn should be shared with investigators as part of a plea negotiation that might spare the community the trauma of a prolonged trial. "She wants to tell the truth," Margaret explained to District Attorney Catherine Mills and the assembled investigators. "All of it. But she wants assurance that the children won't have to testify, that this won't become a circus that damages the young people she's worked with."
Detective Sarah Martinez activated the recording equipment as Evelyn settled into her chair, looking smaller somehow than she had during her years behind the library's reference desk, diminished by the weight of secrets finally being released into daylight. "I want to begin by saying that I have thought about Rebecca Walsh every single day for 13 years, Evelyn began, her voice steady, but carrying the tremor of someone who had rehearsed these words in her mind countless times. Not a morning has passed that I haven't awakened with her name on my lips, not an evening that I haven't fallen asleep asking God to forgive me for what I took from this world." Margaret Caldwell sat beside her client, taking notes, but allowing Evelyn to speak in her own rhythm, understanding that some truths could only emerge in their own time and manner. "You need to understand something about Rebecca," Evelyn continued, her hands folded precisely in her lap. "She was everything I had once been, everything I thought I could be again. Young, eager, passionate about education, determined to make a difference in children's lives. When I first met her during her interview process, I felt like I was looking at myself 40 years earlier." Detective Rodriguez adjusted the recording equipment, ensuring that every word would be preserved with crystal clarity for the legal proceedings that would follow. "The hiring committee met 6 times over the summer of 2010, Evelyn said. "Rebecca was clearly the strongest candidate from the beginning. Excellent references, innovative teaching methods, a genuine love for children that you could see in her eyes when she talked about lesson plans and classroom management. I advocated for her hire from the very first meeting." Sarah Martinez felt a cold confusion settling in her chest. "You supported her candidacy?" "Absolutely. I fought for her when other committee members raised concerns about her lack of permanent teaching experience. I argued that passion and creativity were more valuable than years of routine." Evelyn's voice carried a note of pride that seemed grotesquely inappropriate given the circumstances. "Then why—" Sarah began, but Evelyn held up a gentle hand. "Because I discovered something about myself that I had spent 70 years successfully hiding. Something that even Harold never knew, never suspected." The room fell completely silent except for the quiet hum of the recording equipment and the distant sound of Sunday morning traffic on Main Street. "I discovered that I was capable of jealousy so profound, so consuming, that it could override every moral principle I thought I possessed." Margaret Caldwell shifted in her seat, clearly hearing this part of her client's story for the first time despite their extensive preparation sessions. Rebecca was hired in late August. She started working immediately, subbing for teachers who were out sick, covering classes during planning periods, staying after hours to prepare bulletin boards and organize supplies. She was everywhere, doing everything, and the children adored her instantly. Evelyn paused to sip water from a paper cup, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted it to her lips. "I had been volunteering at the school for 8 years at that point.
8 years of reading to first graders, helping with filing, organizing book fairs, chaperoning field trips. I had become part of the furniture, a reliable fixture that everyone appreciated, but no one really noticed. And then Rebecca arrived, and suddenly all the attention, all the gratitude, all the recognition that I had quietly craved for years was focused on this young woman who had been in our community for less than a month. The confession was taking on the quality of a therapeutic session, with Evelyn examining her own psychology with the same methodical attention she had once brought to cataloging library books. It started small, she said. Comments about how wonderful it was to have young energy in the school. Praise for Rebecca's bulletin board displays that were more creative than
anything the veteran teachers had produced. Parent requests for their children to be placed in whatever class Rebecca would eventually be assigned to teach permanently. Detective Martinez began to understand that they were dealing not with a simple crime of passion, but with something far more complex and psychologically disturbing. I began watching Rebecca more closely, telling myself I was mentoring her, helping her adapt to our community's expectations. But really, I was studying her, looking for flaws, for weaknesses, for some evidence that the admiration she was receiving was undeserved. "And did you find any?" Margaret Caldwell asked quietly. "No," Evelyn admitted. "If anything, closer observation revealed that Rebecca was even more deserving of praise than I had initially realized. She stayed late to tutor struggling students without being asked. She spent her own money on classroom supplies. She remembered every child's birthday, every family situation that required sensitivity. She was genuinely, authentically good at what she did." The pain in Evelyn's voice was unmistakable. The anguish of someone who had been forced to confront her own moral inadequacy in comparison to another person's natural goodness. "The breaking point came in early October," she continued. "Rebecca organized a literacy night for the families, an event designed to encourage parents to read with their children at home. She asked me to help, said she valued my experience and wanted the event to benefit from my knowledge of children's literature." Evelyn's hands tightened in her lap, knuckles whitening with remembered tension. "I should have been honored by her request. Instead, I felt patronized, diminished, reduced to the role of assistant to someone young enough to be my granddaughter. During the planning meeting, Rebecca deferred to my suggestions repeatedly, thanked me for my contributions, made it clear that she considered me a valued collaborator, and I hated her for it." The raw honesty of the admission sent a chill through the room. Sarah had interrogated hundreds of suspects over her career, had heard confessions to crimes ranging from petty theft to capital murder, but she had never encountered anything like this, a woman systematically dissecting her own psychological descent into homicide. "I began following her," Evelyn said simply. "Not with any conscious plan to harm her, but with a compulsion to understand her life, to find some secret weakness that would justify my growing resentment. I learned her routines, her habits, her Friday evening volunteer work at the animal shelter. The notebook we found in your kitchen, you documented her movements. Yes, I told myself it was research, that I was being a concerned community member keeping an eye on a newcomer. But looking back, I understand that I was stalking her, building a detailed picture of her vulnerabilities." Margaret Caldwell made additional notes, preparing for legal strategies that would emphasize her client's mental state while acknowledging the premeditated nature of the surveillance. "On October 19, 2010, I saw Rebecca walking through Willow Creek Park after her volunteer shift at the animal shelter. It was getting dark, and she was alone, taking a shortcut back to her apartment complex. I don't know what possessed me to approach her, but I found myself calling her name. She was happy to see me, grateful for the company on the dark path. We talked about the literacy night, about her hopes for getting the permanent teaching position, about her plans for integrating technology into reading instruction. She was excited, optimistic, full of ideas for making education better for our children. And then, Sarah prompted gently, and then she asked me something that broke whatever restraint I had left. Evelyn's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She asked me if I would be willing to serve as a character reference for her permanent hiring evaluation. She said the principal had mentioned that my opinion carried weight with the school board, that a recommendation from me would be valuable for her career.
The room remained silent as Evelyn struggled to continue. She was asking me to help her secure the position that represented everything I had lost, everything I would never be again. And she was asking with such genuine respect, such authentic gratitude for my potential assistance, that I realized she had no idea how much I envied her, how deeply I resented her youth and energy and natural ability to inspire love in everyone she met. "What happened next?" Margaret Caldwell asked softly. I told her I would be happy to provide the reference, and then I picked up a rock from the path and struck her in the head with it. The words fell into the room like physical objects, hard and undeniable and impossible to take back. There was no moment of decision, Evelyn continued, her voice now completely detached, clinical. No conscious thought process. One moment we were discussing her career prospects, and the next moment I was standing over her body, watching her blood seep into the fallen leaves. Detective Martinez felt physically ill, not just from the brutal simplicity of the act, but from the realization that Rebecca Walsh's murder had been committed by someone she had trusted, someone she had been trying to include and honor. She was still alive initially, unconscious but breathing. I could have stopped there, could have called for help, could have claimed it was an accident. But instead, I knelt beside her and pressed my hands around her throat until she stopped breathing entirely. The confession continued for another hour, with Evelyn providing details that only the killer could have known. The exact location of Rebecca's body, the items that had been moved or disturbed, the route Evelyn had taken to leave the park without being observed. She described returning home that night and scrubbing Rebecca's blood from under her fingernails, burning the clothes she had worn, and then lying in bed beside her sleeping husband while planning the grief and shock she would display when news of the murder spread through the community. "I attended her funeral," Evelyn said, as the confession drew to a close. "I sat in the third pew and wept genuine tears, because by then I understood the magnitude of what I had destroyed. Not just Rebecca's life, but the lives of everyone who loved her, everyone who had depended on her, everyone who had been inspired by her example." "The money you borrowed?" Sarah asked. "The $5,000 from Harold's life insurance?" "I hired a private investigator to monitor the police investigation to ensure they weren't developing any leads that might point to me. He provided regular reports for about 6 weeks, until it became clear that the investigation was focusing on transients and strangers rather than community members." "And the obituary in your wallet?" Evelyn touched her chest, where her purse would normally rest. "A reminder. A punishment I inflicted on myself every day, carrying the evidence of what I had taken from the world." The formal confession concluded with Evelyn's signature on legal documents that would spare Millbrook the trauma of a trial while ensuring that she would spend the remainder of her life in prison. Margaret Caldwell negotiated a plea agreement that acknowledged the premeditated nature of the crime while avoiding the death penalty that might have been sought in a capital murder case. As the legal proceedings concluded and Evelyn was returned to her cell to await sentencing, news of the confession spread through Millbrook like wildfire through dry timber. The local newspaper prepared an extra edition, Television news crews set up permanent encampments outside the police station and courthouse, and the community struggled to process the revelation that their most trusted volunteer had been living a lie for 13 years. At the Millbrook Public Library, head librarian Janet Russell stood in the children's section where Evelyn had read stories just 4 days earlier, surrounded by the chairs and books and educational materials that would forever be associated with one of the most shocking crimes in the town's history. "How do we explain this to the children?" she asked Detective Martinez, who had stopped by to collect additional evidence related to Evelyn's volunteer activities. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I honestly don't know how any of us are supposed to make sense of this."
Outside, reporters interviewed shocked residents who struggled to reconcile their memories of Evelyn Thomas with the brutal reality of her confession. The woman who had baked cookies for school fundraisers had committed murder. The volunteer who had patiently taught children to read had stalked and killed a young teacher whose only crime had been inspiring the kind of love and admiration that Evelyn had craved for herself. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later, on a gray December morning when the first frost had touched Millbrook's magnolia trees and the air carried the promise of winter's arrival. Judge Patricia Reynolds, a 20-year veteran of the criminal justice system, presided over proceedings that had drawn national media attention and transformed the small Alabama courthouse into the epicenter of a story that would be analyzed, discussed, and remembered long after the legal formalities had concluded. Evelyn Thomas, dressed in the same burgundy cardigan she had worn for countless library story times, sat beside her attorney with the quiet dignity that had characterized her public persona for decades. The courtroom was packed with community members, reporters, law enforcement officials, and family members of both victim and perpetrator, all struggling to witness the final chapter of a story that had redefined their understanding of human nature itself. District Attorney Catherine Mills presented the state's case with methodical precision, outlining the premeditated nature of Rebecca Walsh's murder, the 13 years of deception that had followed, and the profound impact that Evelyn's crimes had inflicted not only on Rebecca's family, but on an entire community that had trusted her with their children, their secrets, and their faith in human goodness. Rebecca Walsh was 24 years old when she died, Mills told the court. She had her whole life ahead of her, plans to make education better for Alabama's children, dreams of starting a family, goals that we'll never know she might have achieved because the defendant decided that her own jealousy and resentment were more important than a young woman's right to live. Margaret Caldwell, in response, presented a defense that did not seek to minimize her client's guilt, but rather to provide context for the psychological breakdown that had led to murder. She called expert witnesses who testified about late-life mental health crises, about the way profound loneliness and feelings of irrelevance could create dangerous psychological conditions in otherwise stable individuals. Evelyn Thomas committed a terrible crime, Caldwell acknowledged in her closing argument, but she is also a 70-year-old woman who has spent 13 years living with the knowledge of what she did, who has contributed thousands of hours of genuine service to this community's children, who represents the complicated reality that human beings are capable of both great good and terrible evil, sometimes within the same lifetime. But it was the victim impact statements that provided the most powerful testimony of the day. Rebecca Walsh's parents, William and Dorothy Walsh, had traveled from Ohio to face their daughter's killer for the first time since learning of her identity. Dorothy Walsh, now 71 and using a walker due to arthritis that had worsened during the years of uncertainty about her daughter's death, approached the podium with photographs of Rebecca at various stages of her life: kindergarten graduation, high school prom, college commencement, the last Christmas they had spent together before her move to Alabama.
Rebecca called me every Tuesday and Thursday evening. She would tell me about the children she was working with, about the lesson plans she was developing, about how much she loved teaching, and how grateful she was to have found her calling in life. William Walsh, a retired auto worker whose grief had aged him far beyond his 73 years, spoke directly to Evelyn as he delivered his statement. "You sat beside us at our daughter's funeral. You held my wife's hand during the service. You contributed money to Rebecca's Memorial Scholarship Fund. For 13 years, we wondered who had taken our child from us. And it was you. It was you all along." The impact statements continued for nearly 2 hours, with Rebecca's former colleagues, her college friends, and the families she had worked with in Ohio providing testimony about the life that had been cut short and the potential that had been permanently lost. But perhaps the most devastating testimony came from members of the Millbrook community itself. People who had entrusted their children to Evelyn's care, who had sought her advice during difficult times, who had considered her a cornerstone of their social fabric. Janet Russell, the head librarian, spoke about the children who still asked when Mrs. Thomas would be coming back to read stories. Youngsters too young to understand why their beloved volunteer had suddenly disappeared from their lives. "These children loved her," Janet said, struggling to maintain her composure. "They trusted her completely, and now we have to help them understand that someone they cared about was capable of terrible things. How do we explain to a 7-year-old that the person who taught them about Charlotte's Web, about friendship and sacrifice and doing the right thing, had committed murder?" Jeanette Rodriguez, now 8 years old and accompanied by her father, Detective Mike Rodriguez, read a letter she had written to Mrs. Thomas. "Dear Mrs. Thomas, Daddy says you can't read stories to us anymore because you did something very bad a long time ago. I don't understand how someone who taught us about being good could do something so bad. I'm confused and sad, and I miss story time. I hope you're sorry for what you did. Love, Emma." The letter's childish handwriting and innocent confusion provided a stark reminder of the collateral damage that extended far beyond the immediate victim and her family. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Evelyn Thomas rose slowly and walked to the podium with the careful steps of someone carrying an unbearable weight. She had prepared extensive remarks, but when she opened her mouth to speak, only simple words emerged. "I am sorry," she said, looking directly at Rebecca's parents. "I am sorry for taking your daughter from you. I am sorry for the 13 years of uncertainty and pain I caused by hiding what I had done. I am sorry for betraying the trust of this community and for harming the children who believed in me." She paused, gripping the podium's edges to steady herself. "I cannot explain why I did what I did in any way that would make sense or provide comfort. I was jealous of Rebecca's youth, her energy, her natural ability to inspire love and admiration. I wanted what she had, and when I realized I could never have it, I destroyed her rather than face my own limitations and failures." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "For 13 years, I tried to make amends through service, through working with children, through being the person I should have been all along. But I understand now that no amount of good works can balance the scales when you've taken a life. The only honest thing I can do is accept responsibility for my actions and spend whatever time I have left trying to minimize the harm I have caused." Judge Reynolds listened to all testimony with the careful attention that such proceedings demanded,
But her sentencing decision was ultimately straightforward. Evelyn Thomas was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment that reflected both the premeditated nature of her crime and the decades of deception that had followed. This court has heard extensive testimony about Mrs. Thomas's contributions to this community, Judge Reynolds said as she delivered the sentence. There is no question that she has provided genuine service to many children and families over the years. But we cannot allow those contributions to overshadow the fundamental truth at the center of this case. Mrs. Thomas murdered an innocent young woman out of jealousy and then spent 13 years living a lie while Rebecca Walsh's family suffered without answers. The legal proceedings concluded, but the community's healing process was just beginning. The Millbrook Public Library established the Rebecca Walsh Memorial Reading Program, ensuring that story time would continue while honoring the memory of the young teacher whose life had been cut short. The program was funded through donations from across Alabama and eventually from around the country as news of the case had touched people far beyond the borders of small-town Alabama.
3 months after the sentencing, William and Dorothy Walsh returned to Millbrook to visit the memorial garden that had been planted in Willow Creek Park, near the location where their daughter had died. The garden featured Rebecca's favorite flowers, sunflowers and black-eyed Susans, along with a granite bench inscribed with her favorite quote from Charlotte's Web. "It is not often that someone comes along who is a true friend and a good writer." Charlotte was both. The Walsh family also established a scholarship program at the University of Alabama's College of Education, providing financial assistance for students who demonstrated both academic excellence and a commitment to working with underserved children. The scholarship ensured that Rebecca's passion for education would continue to impact young lives for generations to come. But perhaps the most significant healing came through the difficult conversations that took place throughout Millbrook as residents struggled to understand how they had failed to recognize the warning signs, how they could better protect their community in the future, and how they could help their children process the complex reality that people were capable of both great kindness and terrible cruelty. The elementary school brought in counselors to work with students who had been in Evelyn's reading groups. These sessions focused on helping children understand that adults who commit crimes are responsible for their actions, that the children were not at fault for loving and trusting someone who had hidden a terrible secret, and that it was still safe to form relationships with other caring adults in their lives. Pastor Michael Thompson of First Baptist Church, where Evelyn had been a member for 23 years, delivered a series of sermons about forgiveness, justice, and the mysterious ways that human beings could harbor both light and darkness within their hearts. These sermons were attended not only by his regular congregation, but by community members of all faiths who were seeking guidance in processing their collective trauma. "We are called to forgive," Pastor Thompson said in one of his most widely quoted sermons. But forgiveness does not mean forgetting, and it does not mean avoiding the consequences of our actions. Evelyn Thomas will spend the rest of her life in prison because she chose to commit murder. We can forgive her while still demanding justice for Rebecca Walsh. The case also prompted changes in how volunteers were screened and supervised in Millbrook schools and community organizations. New policies required background checks, regular evaluations, and clearer protocols for reporting concerning behavior, though everyone acknowledged that no system could entirely prevent someone with no prior criminal record from committing violence. Detective Sarah Martinez, who had been promoted to sergeant following her work on the case, often found herself speaking to law enforcement groups about the challenges of investigating crimes committed by seemingly respectable community members. "We have to remember that criminals don't always look like what we expect," she would tell audiences. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who have learned to hide their darkness behind facades of respectability and service. Our job is to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads to places that challenge our assumptions about good and evil. 6 months after Evelyn's sentencing, the Millbrook Public Library reopened its children's section with new volunteers, new programming, and a renewed commitment to creating safe spaces where young people could discover the joy of reading and learning. The section featured a small plaque dedicated the space to Rebecca Walsh's memory, ensuring that future generations of children would know about the young teacher who had loved books and learning and had paid the ultimate price for inspiring jealousy in someone who should have been her mentor and friend. Emma Rodriguez, now 9 years old and an enthusiastic reader, was among the first children to participate in the renewed Storytime program. Her father, Detective Mike Rodriguez, often watched from the back of the room as new volunteers read to the children, grateful that his daughter was learning to trust again, while never forgetting the lessons that tragedy had taught their community about the importance of vigilance, honesty, and the constant need to choose good over evil in the small and large decisions that shaped all their lives. 3 years later, the morning mist rose from Willow Creek like prayers made visible, and Detective Sergeant Sarah Martinez found herself returning to the memorial garden that had become her place of reflection whenever cases grew too heavy or the weight of human darkness threatened to
overwhelm her faith in justice. The granite bench bearing Charlotte's Web quotation was now weathered by Alabama seasons, and the sunflowers had grown tall enough to cast gentle shadows across the walking path where Rebecca Walsh had died. Sarah was no longer the uncertain detective who had first opened Evelyn Thomas's DNA file. 3 years of processing the community's most shocking crime had transformed her into a seasoned investigator, someone other departments consulted when they needed expertise in cases involving seemingly respectable suspects. She had testified at law enforcement conferences about the psychological profiles of hidden killers, had been featured in true crime podcasts discussing the signs that communities might miss when evaluating trusted volunteers and community leaders. But this morning, she was simply a woman who had seen too much, seeking peace in a place where tragedy had been transformed into something resembling hope. "I thought I might find you here." Sarah turned to see Janet Russell approaching with 2 cups of coffee from Murphy's Diner, steam rising from the paper containers in the cool morning air. The head librarian moved more slowly now, aged by the trauma of discovering that someone she had worked beside for years was capable of murder, but her fundamental kindness remained intact. "Couldn't sleep again?" Janet asked, settling beside Sarah on the memorial bench. "The Johnson case is keeping me up," Sarah admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Domestic violence situation that's escalating and the victim won't press charges. Sometimes I wonder if we're just fighting the same battles over and over with different names." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the sun burn through the morning mist and listening to the mockingbirds cycling through their repertoires of borrowed songs. "The children ask about her sometimes," Janet said eventually. "The older ones who remember story time. They want to know if Mrs. Thomas is sorry for what she did, if she thinks about them, if she's learned to be good again." "What do you tell them?" "The truth, as much as they can understand. That people are complicated. That someone can do wonderful things and terrible things in the same lifetime, and that our job is to choose kindness whenever we can." Sarah nodded, thinking about her own daughter, now 11, and beginning to understand that the world contained dangers more complex than stranger abduction or obvious threats. How do you teach a child to be appropriately cautious without destroying their ability to trust? How do you explain that evil sometimes wears familiar faces and speaks in gentle voices? "The scholarship recipients are doing well," Janet continued. 3 young women studying elementary education at Alabama
all planning to work with disadvantaged children, Rebecca would have been proud. The Rebecca Walsh Memorial Scholarship had grown beyond anyone's expectations, funded by donations that continued arriving from across the country. People had been deeply moved by the story of a young teacher's life cut short by jealousy, and they wanted to ensure that other passionate educators would have opportunities to fulfill the dreams that Rebecca never could. 5 years later, Detective Sergeant Sarah Martinez stood in the driveway of 412 Maple Street, watching as the new owners moved their furniture into the small house where Evelyn Thomas had lived for 34 years. The Hendersons were a young couple with twin daughters, teachers from Birmingham who had been drawn to Millbrook by the affordable housing and strong schools, unaware that their new home had once belonged to the town's most notorious criminal. The rose garden that Harold Thomas had planted was now overgrown, but still blooming, yellow and pink blossoms climbing the front porch trellis with determined beauty. Sarah had heard that the new owners planned to restore the garden, to honor the beauty that once flourished here despite the darkness that had ultimately consumed the woman who had tended it. At the Millbrook Correctional Facility for Women, 3 hours north in rural Alabama, Evelyn Thomas maintained her daily routines with the same methodical precision she had once brought to library work. She woke up at 5:30 a.m., attended morning chapel service, worked in the prison library cataloging books and helping inmates develop literacy skills, and spent her evenings writing letters to the children who had been in her reading groups, though prison regulations prevented her from sending them.
The letters, discovered during a routine cell inspection, revealed a woman still struggling to understand her own capacity for violence while desperately trying to atone for irreversible harm. She wrote to Emma Rodriguez, now 12 and captain of her middle school debate team, apologizing for the confusion and fear her actions had caused, and encouraging the girl to continue loving stories and books despite the betrayal of trust she had experienced. She wrote to Marcus Washington, who had overcome his early reading difficulties and was now excelling in honors English, telling him how proud she was of his progress and how sorry she was for disrupting his sense of safety in the world. She wrote to Sophia Chen, now a high school sophomore, planning to study education in college, sharing memories of their conversations about Charlotte's Web and expressing her hope that Sophia would become the kind of teacher Rebecca Walsh had been, passionate, dedicated, and worthy of the trust that children placed in their educators. The letters would never be mailed, but writing them had become Evelyn's form of penance, a way of maintaining connection to the good she had once tried to do while acknowledging the evil she had chosen to commit. Prison psychologist Dr. Amanda Foster, who met with Evelyn twice monthly, noted in her reports that the elderly inmate displayed genuine remorse and had made remarkable progress in understanding the psychological factors that had contributed to her crime. But Dr. Foster also documented her professional opinion that Evelyn Thomas would always be dangerous, that the capacity for violence born of jealousy and resentment remained dormant but not eliminated, requiring permanent incarceration to protect society from potential future victims. 8 years later, the true crime documentary, Hidden in Plain Sight, The Evelyn Thomas Case, premiered on a major streaming platform, bringing national attention to Millbrook's most famous criminal case. The 3-part series featured interviews with investigators, community members, psychological experts, and Rebecca Walsh's family, exploring themes of jealousy, deception, and the ways that communities can fail to recognize dangerous individuals hiding among them. Director Maria Santos had spent 18 months in Millbrook, interviewing everyone who had known either Evelyn or Rebecca, constructing a narrative that sought to understand, rather than sensationalize, the tragic intersection of their lives. The documentary's final episode focused on the community's healing process, the memorial initiatives that had emerged from tragedy, and the ongoing impact of the case on criminal justice approaches to trusted community members who commit violent crimes.
Detective Chief Sarah Martinez, promoted following her exemplary work on several high-profile cases, participated in the documentary reluctantly, concerned about exploiting Rebecca's memory for entertainment purposes, but she ultimately decided that sharing their story might help other communities recognize warning signs and prevent similar tragedies. The hardest part wasn't solving the case, Sarah told the documentary cameras during her interview at the Memorial Garden, now permanently maintained by a team of community volunteers. The hardest part was accepting that evil can look exactly like kindness, that monsters can wear the faces of grandmothers and volunteers and people we trust with our children. The documentary sparked renewed interest in the case, leading to academic studies about the psychology of late-life criminal behavior, policy changes in volunteer screening procedures, and training programs for law enforcement agencies dealing with crimes committed by previously trusted community members. But in Millbrook itself, the documentary's release was met with mixed emotions. Some residents appreciated the sensitive treatment of their story and the platform it provided to honor Rebecca's memory. Others felt that their pain was being commodified for mass consumption, that their private trauma had been transformed into public entertainment. Emma Rodriguez, now 19 and studying criminal justice at the University of Alabama, wrote an editorial for the campus newspaper about growing up in the shadow of the Evelyn Thomas case.
People ask me all the time how it affected me to learn that someone I trusted was a killer, Emma wrote. The truth is, it taught me that the world is more complicated than children's stories usually suggest. Good and evil aren't always clearly marked. Sometimes the people who hurt us are the same people who once helped us. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone else loves and trusts. But it also taught me that communities can heal from terrible wounds, that justice is worth pursuing even when it's painful, and that the best way to honor victims is to keep working toward a world where fewer people have to suffer what Rebecca Walsh and her family suffered. 10 years later, on the 10th anniversary of Rebecca Walsh's murder, Millbrook held its first annual Rebecca Walsh Day of Service, a community-wide volunteer initiative focused on literacy, education, and support for young teachers. Hundreds of residents participated in activities ranging from reading to children at local daycares, to organizing supply drives for underfunded schools, to mentoring college students planning careers in education. The event was coordinated by the Rebecca Walsh Memorial Foundation, established by her parents as a way of transforming their grief into action. William Walsh, now 83 and using a wheelchair due to complications from diabetes, had become an advocate for victim rights and criminal justice reform, speaking at conferences about the long-term impact of violent crime on families and communities. Dorothy Walsh had died 2 years earlier, never fully recovering from the trauma of learning that her daughter's killer had been someone who sat beside her at Rebecca's funeral, someone she had thanked for their kindness and support during her darkest hours. Her final interview, conducted for the documentary just months before her death, had been a powerful testimony about the unique betrayal experienced by families who discover that their loved one's killer had been hiding among their supporters. "She fooled all of us," Dorothy had said, her voice weak but her anger still fierce. "For 13 years, she sent us Christmas cards. She donated money to Rebecca's scholarship fund. She was playing a role, performing grief and sympathy while knowing exactly what she had done and why she had done it." At the Alabama Women's Correctional Facility, Evelyn Thomas, now 81 and suffering from early-stage dementia, no longer maintained the precise routines that had once defined her days. She struggled to remember names and faces, lost track of conversations mid-sentence, and often believed she was back at the Millbrook Public Library, preparing for story time with children who were now adults with children of their own. But even as her memory faded, certain truths remained crystalline in her declining mind. She still knew Rebecca Walsh's name, still remembered the weight of the rock in her hand, still woke each morning with the knowledge that she had committed an unforgivable act. During her lucid moments, she would ask prison staff about the date,
calculating exactly how many days had passed since October 19, 2010, maintaining her private count of time that could never be reclaimed or redeemed. Dr. Amanda Foster, still providing psychological services at the facility, documented in her final assessment of Evelyn Thomas that the patient's dementia appeared to have crystallized around the trauma of her crime, preserving her memories of Rebecca's murder while allowing other recollections to fade into confusion. She has forgotten the names of her husband, her nephew, her childhood friends, but she remembers every detail of the night she killed Rebecca Walsh. It's as if guilt has become the organizing principle of her deteriorating mind, the one truth she cannot escape even as everything else slips away. 13 years later. Detective Chief Sarah Martinez retired from the Millbrook Police Department on a cold February morning, leaving behind a career that had been defined by the Evelyn Thomas case and its aftermath. She had solved dozens of other cases over the years, had earned commendations and promotions and the respect of law enforcement agencies across the Southeast. But she knew that her professional legacy would always be intertwined with the investigation that had revealed how completely a community could misjudge one of its own members. Her retirement party was held at the community center, attended by colleagues, family members, and citizens whose lives had been touched by her dedication to justice. Among the attendees was Emma Rodriguez, now 24 and working as a victim's advocate with the Alabama District Attorney's Office, carrying forward the lessons she had learned as a child about the importance of truth, accountability, and the careful work of healing that must follow every act of violence.
Chief Martinez taught all of us that justice isn't just about solving crimes, Emma told the gathered crowd during her remarks. It's about helping communities heal, about protecting the vulnerable, and about never giving up on the truth even when it's painful to accept. Sarah accepted the accolades with characteristic humility, but her mind wandered to the cases that remained unsolved, the families still waiting for answers, the ongoing responsibility of those who chose to serve justice in an imperfect world. 15 years later, the Rebecca Walsh Memorial Library opened its doors on what would have been Rebecca's 40th birthday, a state-of-the-art facility that combined traditional library services with innovative educational programming. The building, funded through a combination of state grants and private donations, featured advanced technology, flexible classroom spaces, and a children's section designed to inspire young readers while maintaining appropriate security measures. Janet Russell, now in her 60s and serving as the Memorial Library's first director, had insisted that the building include a permanent exhibition about Rebecca's life and work, ensuring that future generations would remember her not as a victim, but as an educator whose passion for learning had inspired a community to create something beautiful from tragedy. The exhibition featured Rebecca's lesson plans, photographs of her classroom, testimonials from students she had taught during her brief time in Millbrook, and interactive displays that allowed visitors to explore the impact of literacy on individual lives and entire communities. But the most powerful element of the exhibition was a video interview with Marcus Washington, now 31 and serving as principal of a Title I elementary school in Birmingham. Marcus spoke about how Rebecca's encouragement during his early reading struggles had changed the trajectory of his entire life, inspiring him to pursue education as a career and to dedicate his professional life to helping children overcome the obstacles that poverty and family dysfunction could place in their paths toward academic success. "Mrs. Walsh saw something in me that I didn't see in myself," Marcus told the camera, his voice filled with the authority and compassion that made him an effective educational leader. "She believed I could succeed when I didn't believe it myself. That's the kind of teacher every child deserves, and that's the kind of legacy that can never be destroyed by violence or hatred." 18 years later, Evelyn Thomas died on a Tuesday morning in the prison medical facility, her body finally succumbing to the combination of age, dementia, and the accumulated weight of 18 years behind bars. She had been unconscious for the final week of her life,
cared for by medical staff who knew her only as an elderly inmate with a violent past, unaware of the thousands of children she had once taught to love reading or the community service that had defined most of her adult life. Her death was noted briefly in the Millbrook Gazette, a 3-paragraph obituary that mentioned her conviction for Rebecca Walsh's murder, but also acknowledged her decades of volunteer work prior to the crime. The newspaper's editors, struggling with how to summarize such a contradictory life, ultimately decided that honesty required acknowledging both the good and evil that had coexisted in one human being. David Thomas, Evelyn's nephew, arranged for a simple graveside service attended by fewer than a dozen people. No flowers were brought, no eulogies delivered, no attempts made to celebrate a life that had been irreparably stained by murder. But David read a brief statement acknowledging his aunt's crimes while also mourning the loss of someone who had once been capable of genuine kindness and love. Evelyn Thomas took a life, and she paid for that crime with her freedom and ultimately with her own life. We cannot forget what she did to Rebecca Walsh and her family, but we can also not forget that human beings are complex, that good and evil can exist in the same heart, and that our job as a community is to choose mercy and justice in equal measure. The burial took place in Millbrook's oldest cemetery, in a section reserved for indigent burials, far from the elaborate headstones and family plots that marked the final resting places of the town's most prominent citizens. Harold Thomas was buried 2 rows away, his grave marked with a granite monument that made no mention of his wife's crimes.
Preserving for future generations the memory of a man who had lived and died without knowing that the woman he loved was capable of murder. 20 years later. On the 20th anniversary of Rebecca Walsh's death, the Millbrook Elementary School dedicated its new reading garden to her memory, a peaceful outdoor space where teachers could conduct classes under the shade of oak trees and children could discover the joy of reading in natural surroundings. The garden featured comfortable seating areas, weather-resistant bookshelves, and a small amphitheater, where visiting authors could share their stories with young audiences. Emma Rodriguez Chen, now 34 and married to a fellow attorney, brought her twin 5-year-old daughters to the dedication ceremony. As she watched them explore the garden's reading nooks and interactive displays, she thought about the strange journey that had brought her from a confused 7-year-old to a victim's advocate, to a mother determined to raise children who understood both the beauty and complexity of the world they would inherit. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Mrs. Thomas had made different choices?" asked Sophia Chen Martinez, now a high school principal and Emma's lifelong friend, as they watched their children play together in Rebecca's memorial garden. "All the time," Emma admitted, "but I've learned that wondering doesn't change anything. What matters is what we do with the lessons we've learned, how we use our experiences to make better choices than the people who hurt us." The dedication ceremony concluded with the planting of a sunflower garden, Rebecca's favorite flowers now growing in soil that had been enriched by 2 decades of community commitment to transforming tragedy into hope. As the children helped scatter seeds and water the freshly turned earth, their laughter provided a soundtrack of resilience that would have made Rebecca proud. 23 years later. Detective Maria Santos, no relation to the documentary director, was reviewing cold cases in the Millbrook Police Department's modernized evidence room when she discovered a box labeled Thomas, Evelyn, Personal Effects. The box had been stored since Evelyn's death 5 years earlier, its contents never claimed by family members who wanted no reminders of their relatives' crimes. Inside, Maria found the usual items: clothing, toiletries, a few photographs, and a collection of letters that had never been mailed. But at the bottom of the box was something unexpected: a manuscript, nearly 200 pages of careful handwriting that appeared to be Evelyn's attempt to write a complete account of her life.
From her childhood in rural Alabama, through her marriage to Harold, her years of teaching and library work, and ultimately her decision to murder Rebecca Walsh. The manuscript was not a justification or excuse for her actions, but rather a painfully honest examination of the psychological forces that had led a seemingly good person to commit an evil act. I want people to understand that monsters don't always look like monsters, Evelyn had written in the manuscript's conclusion. Sometimes they look like grandmothers and volunteers and people who genuinely love children. I loved those children I read to, and I also killed an innocent woman out of jealousy. Both things are true. Both things are part of who I was. Detective Santos showed the manuscript to Chief Rodriguez. Mike Rodriguez had been promoted following Sarah Martinez's retirement. And together, they decided that portions of it should be shared with criminal justice researchers studying the psychology of late-life violence and the warning signs that communities might learn to recognize.
But they also agreed that the manuscript's most personal revelations should remain private, that some truths were too raw and painful to be shared with the world, that even in death, Evelyn Thomas deserved some measure of dignity despite the terrible choices she had made in life. 25 years later. The Millbrook Community Peace Center opened on October 19, 2035, exactly 25 years after Rebecca Walsh's murder, as a living memorial to the power of community healing and the ongoing work of choosing justice over vengeance, understanding over hatred, and hope over despair. The center provided counseling services for crime victims, conflict resolution training for community leaders, and educational programming about the psychological and social factors that could lead to violence. Its mission statement, carved in granite at the building's entrance, read, "In memory of Rebecca Walsh and in commitment to preventing future tragedies through understanding, healing, and community action." The center's first director was Dr. Emma Rodriguez Chen, who had completed her doctorate in criminal psychology while raising her children and maintaining her work as a victim's advocate. She brought to the position a unique combination of personal experience with community trauma and professional expertise in helping individuals and communities recover from violent crime. "We can't bring Rebecca back," Emma said during the center's opening ceremony, speaking to a crowd that included Rebecca's elderly father William, now 95, and one of the last surviving family members who had known her personally. "But we can honor her memory by working to create a world where fewer families have to experience what the Walsh family experienced, where communities are better equipped to recognize and address the warning signs of violence before tragedy occurs." The center's opening ceremony concluded with the reading of names, not just Rebecca Walsh, but all the victims of violent crime in Millbrook's history. A reminder that every loss of life represented not just statistics, but individual human beings whose stories deserve to be remembered and honored. As the sun set over the memorial garden that had grown from a place of death into a symbol of community resilience, children who had never heard of Evelyn Thomas played on swings and slides while their parents discussed school fundraisers and upcoming Little League games, and all the ordinary concerns that comprised the fabric of small-town life. The story of Rebecca Walsh and Evelyn Thomas had become part of Millbrook's permanent history, a tale told to new residents and young people as a reminder that communities must remain vigilant about the people they choose to trust, while never allowing suspicion and fear to destroy the bonds of mutual support and care that made life worth living. In the end, perhaps that was Rebecca's true legacy, not just the scholarships and memorials that bore her name, but the ongoing commitment of an entire community to choose light over darkness, trust over suspicion, healing over hatred,
and the difficult but necessary work of building a world worthy of the young woman whose life had been cut short by jealousy and rage, but whose memory continued to inspire acts of kindness, justice, and hope.